There, as we're scanning over the book of Genesis, as we go through trying to hit the high spots of Genesis, I have to depend upon people to read portions of Genesis that we've not covered. But as I mentioned before, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 deal with the flood. There are 4 chapters that deal with the flood. And the last part of chapter 9 is about the 3 sons of Noah, and that's the end of that. And then the generations of Noah began. In chapters, in chapter 10, is about the descendants of Noah, and they're being scattered out into the world. After Noah, as I mentioned before, and the flood that came then, there was a sort of washing clean or a new start on the earth, as there was in the beginning with man and the woman, with Adam and Eve in the beginning. So in chapter 10, we have the generations that are listed. Obviously, that is not very uplifting to just read names. And so chapter 10 we're pretty well skirting over. Chapter 11, the one interesting thing that's in chapter 11, and I think it's really interesting, is the Tower of Babel. People get together on the earth. It's almost like the Garden of Eden again, where they have all of the things that they need, and there is that they're going to build a tower up to the heavens. They don't need God to get to the heavens. They can build a tower up there. And so they build a tower up to the heavens, and they say, we'll make a name for ourselves. We'll be great. And God scatters their tongue. In this instance, there is no mention of sin and such as that is in Genesis 3, but it's still something on the same order. God gives man another chance. There's a great deal of sin, but he scatters their tongue, and they spread over the face of the earth. And the rest of chapter 11 is back to genealogies, and it brings us down this time to Abram and his family. First, of course, it's to his father, Terah. Terah has 3 sons. The oldest is Abram, and the second is Nahor, and the third is Haram. Now, Haram has a child, two children actually. By implication, there is a girl as well, but Lot is his son, and then Haran dies, and so that's the end of him. There are just 2 of the sons of Terah now, with Terah in the Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Ur of the Chaldees, it's been mentioned so many times that you may be bored by it, but Ur of the Chaldees was a great city in the ancient world. It was one of the first cities of the ancient world. Archaeologists have done a great deal of study in the area of Ur of the Chaldees. It is located in Mesopotamia. Ur of the Chaldees, the ruins are in Mesopotamia. The old city is not very far from Babylon, and where Nebuchadnezzar forcibly settled many of the Jews after the fall of Jerusalem. And so it is in lower Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldees, and it was a very prosperous, first-rate city in the ancient world. There was everything from a sewer system that went throughout the city to many innovations, particularly grain. It was during this period of time. Most anthropologists think that we really should think of the start of the human race, or the sustaining of the human race, and their advancement in terms of the cultivation of certain grains, particularly wheat and rice, things like that, where there's a great deal of nutritional value for the effort that is put into them. And so Ur of the Chaldees was a very advanced city. Actually, it had reached a high point before the time of Abraham, they tell me, but it was still an advanced city during the time of Abraham, or Abram. The name Abraham and Abram the name Abraham doesn't actually come up until chapter 17 in Genesis with circumcision. I think that's chapter 17, isn't it? It's chapter 17, the covenant that God made with Abram, and changes his name to Abraham. Both words mean something on the order of father of a multitude. Av in Hebrew is the word for father, and so Avi, my father. Abimelech was a generic name, I think, like Pharaoh was. But there are a couple of people named Abimelech in the book of Genesis, in addition to the son of Gideon later on in the conquest of the land. But Abimelech means a father of a king. Melech is the word for king. And so Abimelech means my father is a king, or something on that order. So there was a period of time where Abram lived with his father Terah. Terah was sort of the head of the clan, and Haran, the youngest son, died. He has one child, or he has one male child, Lot, and a girl by the name of Milcah. But we'll talk about her more later on. One of the sons of Abram, Nahor, marries his niece Milcah. She becomes his wife. Abraham marries somebody apparently outside the clan, Sarai. And so the two sons, Nahor and Abram, are married. And of course, Abram and Sarai have no children. But they live in the land in Ur of the Chaldees for some time. And then it appears, it's a little confusing how it unfolds if you read it closely in the book of Genesis. Genesis 12 begins the narrative about Abram, about the one whom God chose. Before that time, God dealt with humankind as a race. Noah was not of the people of Israel, but was sort of a representative of the race. It's the way he's presented, at least, in chapter 6 of Genesis. But with the advent of Abram, with his appearance in the Bible, and God focuses again on a family, on Abram and Sarai. Now, it is not until sometime later that they have a child. But the communication, the one that God deals with for several years, is Abram. First, Terah, it appears that Terah is told to leave the land of his birth. At least to me it seems that way at the last of chapter 11 in Genesis. And so they leave Ur of the Chaldees and travel the band. Terah is the head, of course. He is the oldest male. And then there is Nahor and Abram, or I should say Abram and Nahor, as Abram is the oldest. And so they leave with their wives. Nothing is said about a wife of Terah. And so they travel on northwest in a northwesterly direction, traveling up the Euphrates River. Now, where Abraham actually lived, the Greeks called it Mesopotamia, Potamos, Meso means in the midst of, and Potamos means river. And so it was the land in the midst of the rivers. The Tigris on the south, the Euphrates was the river on the south, and the Tigris the river on the north. And so Abram, Terah and his clan moved in a northwesterly direction up the Euphrates Valley until they came to the great city Haran. Now Haran is mentioned here, and it's also mentioned later on. There was a great battle as the world changed from one emperor to another, somewhere in the time of Cyrus, the Persian king. But but Haran was a very important city, a great city, and so Terah, apparently on the way to Canaan, God has told them to leave the land of their birth, but on the way to Canaan, they seem to stop at Haran. And then at Haran, Terah dies, the old man of the family, and it leaves Abraham as the head. Now, nothing is said about Nahor coming with, presumably he was with Abraham and Terah whenever they left Ur of the Chaldees to go northward toward Haran, but nothing is said of Nahor for some time. Jacob, you remember when Jacob comes along, the grandson of Abraham, actually finds both of his wives up in that area. So there is a long period of time when the descendants of Abram and the family of Terah, which is part of Abraham's family, but still a part that stayed behind in Mesopotamia. And so God repeats the command to Abraham. From this point on, Abraham is at the center of the story. We've looked at people like Noah and his sons, and Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel. We have seen other people that God has dealt with. But from this point onward, the story is about Abraham. And then later on, the descendants of Abraham, the people of Israel. When the Apostle Paul wants to speak of his own pedigree, as in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and he speaks of his pedigree in Philippians and in 2 Corinthians, he says of himself first that he is a Hebrew. That's his oldest term. At this point, at least, nobody has called Abraham a Hebrew. There are similar words that crop up in a number of the text of the period of time that Abraham lives in. The names are names like Abram and Terah and the rest of the Nahor. The names are names like appear in the text outside of the Bible during this period of time. It happens. Abraham and Terah were probably to date them about 1800 BC during this period of time. But they come up to Haran. Terah dies in Haran, and Abraham is told again to leave the country of his birth. Well, of course, he's left Ur of the Chaldees, where he was born, but he's made himself pretty well at home in Haran, and now God tells him to leave. So he crosses the Euphrates River. There are people in older works, if you look at them, and unfortunately there are people who still read these older works and don't know advancements that have been made in the science of the area. But in older work, it is supposed that Hebrew means the one who came from across the river being the Euphrates. But nobody today, nobody today believes that that's the origin of the word Hebrew. We'll talk about the word Hebrew later on. It's not been used yet. The first time that it is used is of Abraham. Abraham is called a Hebrew one time, and it comes up very many times when we're talking about Joseph. Abraham travels southward. Now he's from Haran. Travels southward along the east bank of the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee. He apparently crossed over, at least there is a fording place for the Jordan River. The Jordan River, it always fascinates. It really doesn't carry a lot of water. It's not a big stream, and yet it's probably one of the most famous streams in all the world. Everybody knows about the Jordan River, at least if they've had any Christian background. And so somewhere around Shechem, Abraham crosses the Jordan River over into the land of Canaan. Nothing is said much about his stay in Shechem. He builds an altar to the Lord. We shouldn't think, I don't believe, that we should think of Abraham in this early days as a great spiritual leader in knowing the God of Israel. It takes him some time. At this time he probably does worship some of the gods of the land. But he comes more and more to rely on Yahweh, on the God who will become the God of the people of Israel. But he's the God of Abraham. And so he travels on south from Shechem to a place near Bethel. Bethel means house of God. And it really has Bethel has a lot more to do with Jacob later on than the place does with Abraham. But he travels, there's an area between Ai. You might remember Ai from Joshua, when Joshua's second great battle was against Ai after he fought Jericho. But somewhere between Ai and Bethel, Abraham camps again and builds an altar. He's traveling southward, and there is a great famine that comes in the land. And because of the famine, Abraham takes the people that are with him, and there aren't too many close people with him, but he takes them on southward toward the land of Egypt. It says when Abram left Haran, that he took all the property that they had, in the animals and the souls that he had gained. So presumably Abraham took slaves with him. He has a slave later on by the name of Eliezer, whom he sends back to Mesopotamia to get Isaac a wife. And so there is slavery, we should understand, is not a modern invention. As long as there have been records of people, there have been slaves. And so, and nobody from the ancient world, not even in the New Testament, nobody from the ancient world questions slavery as far as an ethical or a moral problem. And so Abraham travels on with his slaves and with Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and they travel on southward. The people of that part of the world, of Canaan, of that part of the world, regularly, when things got really hard up for food, they went to the land of Egypt. Egypt, you see, was not dependent on rain to cause to give them crops, but in the land of Egypt, the Nile River just overflowed its banks and brought down all kinds of nourishing dirt with them from Central Africa. I am told that the Nile is the longest river in the world. It goes, a great deal of its length is through a wretched desert. Egypt is dry. When I was in Egypt with a group of students, it came up a thunderstorm. We didn't think much about it, as the students. The guide said he was probably close to 40 years old, and he said from his birth he could not remember a thunder shower like that coming up on where he lived in Egypt. And so we thought it was normal. But the Nile River goes through a wretched dry land, but it does overflow its bank, and the Egyptians, given time, captured much of the water and the nutrients of the soil, and they had crops, even when there was a famine, through the rest of the land. And so Abraham goes to Egypt with his family because he needs to in order to live. But he makes a bargain. It's one of the most famous bargains I expect in the Bible. Makes a bargain with his wife. Will you say you're my sister? Now I can't imagine she had to have been 85 or so years old. I can't imagine her being the most beautiful woman in the world at age 85. But I don't know all of the aging processes that were in operation then. There's a lot mentioned about age and how long people lived. And so Sarai, the people with Sarai, her husband and others, Abraham said, the Egyptians will kill me in order to have you as a wife. And so would you say you're my sister? And so she did. That, of course, was an out-and-out lie. But Abraham is not Jesus Christ. He didn't live free from sin. And in time, the famine was not as severe, and the king of Egypt tried to take Sarai to be his wife, but when he did, all kinds of disease, his whole house was on the verge of being destroyed. And so he finds out about it and comes to Abraham. He says, "Why did you lie to me?" And Abraham said, "Well, I was afraid you'd kill me," which, of course, he had a legitimate fear there. And so Sarai is returned to Abraham, and Abraham and Sarai and Lot travel back north this time, north and east, toward the land of Israel. Travel pretty much the route I expect that the people of the Exodus traveled, but they didn't travel nearly so long. First, Abraham goes up to the area of Bethel. He finds the altar that had been torn down over time, and he rebuilds it and repairs it and offers sacrifices to the Lord. And then he travels on south. Lot is going to enter the story, and the next lesson is about Lot and about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But in the portion we're studying today, it's not about Lot yet. And Abraham comes back up and stays for a time, and it's really hard to figure out the time in many instances. And so they stay for a time there, and Abraham then travels back to the south to the area of Hebron. Now Hebron, if you take the south end of the Dead Sea, and you go directly westward, you won't be far from Hebron. Hebron was an important city in ancient times. It still is an important city. If you go there, I'm told, I've never been there, but the natives will show you the place where Abraham's tomb was and all of that. And of course, nobody knows where his tomb was. But Abraham and Sarai lived in the area of Hebron then for the rest of their lives. Jacob is born there. Jacob and Esau, and Isaac is born there, and Ishmael is born there. And so they stay in the area of Hebron. And the rest of the story of Abraham unfolds as his son and then his grandson and their families each grow to maturity until they all finally come to the land of Egypt. Well, that's the end of the lesson today, and we'll go on from there in Genesis the next time. I find the story of Abraham fascinating. If I've made a mistake in recalling some of the incidents, chalk it up to some of my own personal shortcomings, and correct me where I need to be. Thank you for listening. Bye.